EPF is governed by the Employees Provident Fund Act 1991. It's essentially a scheme of savings for your retirement and management of savings and for matters incidental thereto. In Section 43, as I'm sure you're aware, every employee and every employer of a person who is an employee shall be liable to pay monthly contributions on the amount of wages at the rate that is set out in the Act itself. So an EPF has to be credited to the members' fund by the 15th day of every month. You can see sections 54 and 55 actually spell out when withdrawals of EPF funds are allowed. And this is, of course, leaving aside eligibility to withdraw once you reach the age of 55. So having looked at just some of the basic structure of the EPF Act, I want to explore the question of who is an employer and who is an employee. Now, this is set out in Section 2 of the Act. An employer is somebody with whom an employee has entered into a contract of service or apprenticeship. An employee is the flip side of it, is somebody who is employed under a contract of service, whether written or oral, and whether express or implied, to work for an employer. This person would be considered an employee under the definition of the Act, is to look at some of these non-exhaustive factors and also where you don't fall foul of these categories. So just to repeat, because I think it's worth bearing in mind, the test to determine whether somebody is an employee for the purposes of the EPF Act is to ask whether a contract of service or contract for service has been entered into. And what is a contract of service? That is where one person agrees to employ another as an employee and the other person agrees to serve as an employee. Part-time worker can still be considered as an employee. But here, when we talk about contract for service, it's better described as someone who is working for you on a case-by-case basis. So this person will usually be a freelancer or an independent contractor providing. So we move on quite quickly to payments liable for EPF contribution. Of course, your salary naturally would be. Any arrears of wages, bonus is subject to EPF. Any commission or allowance that you make is also subject to EPF contribution. And this part is on payments not liable for EPF contribution. So now if you're a company director, this part might be more interesting, whether you can be made personally liable for outstanding EPF contribution. If you were a director during the time that EPF was supposed to be paid to the employees, but they were not paid, the director can and shall actually be held liable to pay for those contributions. So that is actually quite an important thing to take note of if you're a director. So when I talk about offenses, I think the flip side of it is also you will know your rights to it, because if your rights are breached, there will be an offense under the EPF Act. So I've picked out some of the I guess, the more notable and interesting ones. So moving on to your rights as an employee, if let's say your employer has committed any of the aforementioned offenses, what you need to do is really to act quickly. How does one go about recovering unpaid EPF contributions? We look at Section 65 of the EPF Act. So usually in the circumstances we encounter, EPF is the body that will sue the employer to recover unpaid EPF contributions. Practically speaking, it would be wise not to sit on your right. I would say you should act as soon as you discover any discrepancy. So you want to check your EPF account periodically, lodge a complaint with EPF. You want to follow up on a complaint lodged with EPF to ensure that any civil action to recover unpaid amounts is brought well within the 6 years.